Probably covering in this session today one of the more, if not most, difficult parts of this quarter's study. I'll explain why that's the case in a second, but before we do so, let's go ahead and bow our heads together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share in spiritual things. We thank you for your word. It's our hope as we study together this morning that you open our eyes to your will and your intention for us. You help us as students to be good listeners, foremost to your word and instruction to us, but also give us the capacity and the insight to properly work through your message. Help us then to share not only our lives with each other and as an example of the cross, but also your word to others. And we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so my reason for saying that this is probably the most difficult is from my end of the table. It's a little bit more challenging to explain in our time frame. And so what we're doing is we're taking a whole lot of stuff and trying to squeeze it in a small amount of time. But the things that we're going to cover are going to be super important as additional skills to work through the remaining 10 weeks after this. So what we're going to provide is an opportunity to think about something that I think is important and maybe new. It may not be. For some of you, you might be like, oh, that's an old hat. But it might be new. And we're going to be looking at specifically the information we have as to how first century readers understood Old Testament prophecy and the principles and tools they used to figure out what it is that God is doing. We're going to do that from two corners. Corner number one is I'm going to share some of the first century writings that exist about how they did things. But most specifically, we're going to pay attention to how Paul, a great example of that era, does that with a couple of Bible passages. Now, those passages and the concepts are super familiar to us. They're not surprising. They're things like the allegory of Sarah and Hagar and a few things like that, that Paul is pulling these ideas and he makes this kind of complicated or patterned argument regarding the relationship of those two people to the relationship of the covenants and of Christians in the first century and the 21st century. And the first classes to get us here, our first two, we took about a little time to talk about how, number one, the Bible is a unified story. Even though it's got 40 to 50 authors, 66 distinct books in the Protestant layout of the canon, two big covenant spaces. It goes from origins of humanity until the Bible itself kind of goes through the historical side, all the way to the close of the first century. All those things take place, though, telling one story. And then we included a little bit of additional information on the way in which we read the Bible, talking about types and shadows and the way those things, those patterns produce for us a better picture of things. We talked about one super important tool in Bible reading, and that's this, that when the Bible, New Testament in particular, says this is that, that's a super important principle in understanding what God means. It's not just, though, in the New Testament. Sometimes in the Old Testament, the prophets will say, this is that. It's the strongest witness or evidence that we have that says God wants us to know or understand this a certain way. After that, he expects us to develop understanding, the capacity to work through things. Like we noted in our sermon recently, looking at some of the aspects of the elevation of Solomon to God's anointed king, wisdom and understanding in the Bible is more about ethical context than it is like brain capacity. And so that's another component to think about when we're looking at prophecy, is what's the ethical or moral implication to it. And so with that, and remembering what Jesus says here, all these things are pointing to him, let's talk a little bit about 2 steps to get us there. We're going to talk about this first century reading in a second, but we're going to talk about another component of it to start with, and that is the principles of typology and allegory. These are things that are, and especially with allegory, very common in human conversation. Not every single story someone tells you is intended to be absolutely and exclusively literal. We're super familiar with it. I don't mean to ruin your perception of some of our founding fathers, but the entire story about George Washington and the cherry tree is not factual. It is not a real part of his history, but it was told as a story to describe an attribute about him. What's the story of the cherry tree in Washington? So the meaning is honesty, and it's like he had to admit that he just couldn't tell a lie, and so he's so honest, but it's not fact. It's a story, and so we're accustomed already to having types of stories that exist that aren't factual. That's step 1. Step 2, sometimes, and we're already accustomed to this, stories are told that are very realistic, that could happen, but that's not the intended meaning. An example of that are parables. The parables of Jesus, all of them, are things that could happen and did happen, but Jesus is not telling them because the story itself is super important. The story of the man who had a lot of stuff and said, I'll build a bigger barn. That's a real thing that can happen, right? Is he specifically talking about a unique human being who had a lot of stuff? Probably not. But the meaning then becomes something more. There's something more to it. So we're used to parables doing this. Allegory is a form of a parable in that principle of here's a real thing, but it's teaching us some other thing. And an allegory seeks to connect a symbolic or spiritual message in a way that goes beyond the literal. It treats a story of maybe even historical narrative as maybe teaching a second truth to it. The Old Testament then becomes a text that can be read in 2 ways. The literal historical record and the Christological, it's a big fancy word, Christ-looking level. In typology, real events become symbols of spiritual ones. And so in both cases, Christ is then seen as the greater reality rather than the Old Testament just telling you some stories. Here's some ways to think about this. When we read through the creation accounts, Genesis 2 and 3, we read it firstly as a very literal thing, right? This is stuff that God said happened. It's very otherworldly because how many of you have personal experience with humanity created in a day? So it's very otherworldly, right? These are things that don't happen in a physical sense that we're accustomed with. You don't have a day and then you get an atom fully formed and he's full grown into a fully mature world that's got everything working however it's supposed to work. So that's an otherworldly thing, but we read it literally. We read it, this is a thing that happened. We think about it literally first. The rest of the Bible's usage of this story bounces between literal, talking about this being the beginning of things from the beginning, but also at times pulling from the elements to talk about principles. Talk about the principles included in the prophecies that are there, even some of the hidden bits and pieces of the curses to man and woman, and the blessings that are embedded in that are pulled from that in a Christological, Christ-forward way. Let me show you some examples of this, and we'll look at two really quickly. The first one comes from Genesis 14. So if you open your Bibles, Genesis 14, that's the story of a random king of Salem. Not Salem, Oregon, different Salem. But the text there, this is Genesis 14 and going into the next few verses. Actually, Johnny, do you want to read verses 18 through verse 20 right now for us?
And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share.
All right, I want you to think for a second from this series of little bits and pieces here forward until, say, Hebrews, or even the Gospels to a smaller degree. Is there a lot of mention of this particular king of Salem? Does it come up in the Old Testament stories very much?
Not very much.
It's just a little bit of information. Yet, by the time we get to the New Testament, Jesus and the writers who are inspired are telling this story that Jesus is a priest after the order or according to, this is Hebrews 7, the order of Melchizedek. And just assumes that we're going to get it. We're going to catch it. It's foreshadowing something, and we're not given any clues that this is going to be like a big deal in that story. It's just, hey, there's this thing, and it's a bit of a mystery. Because this is prior to the arrival of the full priesthood of the people of Israel. So this is like a priest that we don't get a backstory on. It's in a time period where most of the religious practice is not structured through priesthood. It is patriarchal in religion and practice for Israel here. So it's weird. It's incomplete. But it foreshadows rather than foretells. That is, nowhere in this story does anyone say, this is for the future. It just says, this happens. Here's a thing. And then the New Testament writers will say, hey, that thing that happened, it's actually looking forward to that. Another one, by the way, here's a few of them if you want to write them down, is in Jonah chapter 1. In verse 17, something greater than Jonah is here. That's pulled into Matthew 12. So that's a regular occurrence in the Old Testament. Here's another one that's super familiar of this concept of typology and allegory. Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. When that story unfolds, is anything in the way the story is told indicative that this is for the future? Like anything that says, oh, and one's going to come like this in the future, or anything that says there's going to be a Messiah coming that's going to be like this? Even more narrowly, when you think about how he's carrying the wood for his sacrifice with him, it pictorially in an allegory format matches Jesus carrying his own cross. Those images kind of come there as a part of the sacrifice picture. These are looking forward, but not in the this is that way. Another one that's pretty familiar, and we mentioned it I think last week, the bronze serpent that's lifted up in Numbers chapter 21. Christ then is lifted up on the cross for our healing. And Jesus is the one who makes the connection. But nowhere in the original indication is there, hey, this is prophetic. This is forthtelling. This is future telling. It's just, this happens. God does this. Jesus is the one who takes point 1 and links it to point 2 and gives us, hey, that is now made full in this event. Let's look at this last one. This is from Galatians chapter 4. Trent, you want to read for us, if you will? In Galatians 4, verse 21 through verse 26.
Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically, that these women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother.
Key points to catch. If you're underlining your Bible, note that this is the Bible saying allegory interpretation exists. Like, this is a thing. When Paul says this can be interpreted in an allegorical format, like these are more than just human stories. So Paul's allegory here of, let me back up. Of Hagar and Sarah are now shown to be symbols of the 2 covenants. And he's telling us that there is a God-level instruction to be gleaned from paying attention to the relationship. Now here's where, again, careful reading comes into play. Every single time you think there's an allegory does not necessarily then mean that there is one. You've got to be a careful reader and pay attention to the broader story of the Bible. And that's why you do things like, hey, you know what? If my feeling that there's an allegory that's super important here is accurate, then it shouldn't contradict the rest of the Bible. Like, it shouldn't do that. Further, it should match the sum total of the rest of the Bible's teaching. Because even if it doesn't contradict, it may not necessarily be accurate. It could be just, hey, that's neat. I'm glad you found that this kind of looks like that. So careful reading prevents us then from pushing allegory too far and pushing figures too far. But it's a valid way to think about the Bible and Bible stories. It also then can be helpful, and that's what Paul does here, in taking something that's hard to accept, hard to understand, and giving us some context to see these are God's people dealing with it in the past. Because the relationships of these 2 women and the way it affected that family is similar to how it was affecting the Christians in the first century with these issues of the covenant. That's one of the reasons Paul, I think, makes that connection. Second part of this morning is to think about this, I think, the most difficult part of things, midrash and pesher. These are first century terms that go all the way into now, particularly amongst Jewish communities. And they are the basket words that describe how these communities read their Bibles. When they would open the scroll and they'd be trying to dig through the prophets, they would have to try to figure out what God was talking about, just like you and I do. And some of that is what happened, what historical happened, but some of it is them trying to think about what the plan of God was. And so one of their methodologies, the first one for us, is midrash. It's a Hebrew word that we brought into English that simply means to seek, or to inquire. It is essentially their more creative or exploratory method. They go verse by verse, but they don't just explain the text. They fill in the missing gaps of history. So if you had a passage that had 3 verses, and each verse was separated by about 5 years, this is my illustration of it, simplified, then Midrash approaches to explanation and interpretation would say, here's what we think happened in those 10 years, 20 years between each of the verses. This is what we think is going on. That's not uncommon for us too. I want you to think about the way you've tried to work through the story of everything between God kicking people out of the garden and Noah. How much stuff happens in that time frame? Quite a bit, right? How much of it is given to us as details? We get like a little bit. We get like 2.5 chapters full of genealogies and a trajectory. So with our factual information, just in the Genesis account, not going forward to some other information we get a little bit later, we know that population grows. We know that as population grows, their morality seems to suffer in every generation. We know by the time Noah's on the table, somebody's really old. Who's the oldest person in this story? He's got a very, very famous name. Methuselah. And his death seems to coincide with the flood. So at that point now, we start making presumptives. Why did he not make it out of the flood? What about everything else? How advanced were they? What kind of lifestyle do they have? What was their diet? Are those questions you've asked yourself in the past? You're not deriving a conclusion, but out of curiosity. Guess what you've been doing? You've been engaging in what is essentially the practice of Midrash. That is the same thing that they did. The only difference is that in the community of the first century Jewish spiritual culture, it was common to do so out loud. So all the things that you have in your head that you've wondered about, they would sit around in the synagogues in their rectangular places of worship and talk it out. And by the way, if you've ever sat up to 2 a.m. with your buddies over a coffee at like a Waffle House somewhere talking about these same things, you're not that much different. In my case, it was Denny's and there was no coffee involved. But we had these same conversations out of curiosity. Same kind of context. So roughly, that's what Midrash is. They also would include dialogue about motives, and they would work through some of their other literature in the same way. Here's the caution. Over the years, you have probably seen someone cite a source from a rabbi and said, this rabbi in the 3rd century suggested this as the interpretation to the passage. Almost always, it's coming from Midrash, like this creative reading of things. As such, when you see someone cite it, it's the equivalent of a 19-year-old at Denny's at 2 a.m. coming up with an idea. It very well could be the best idea on the planet. But in the same textual box of like historical writings, right after it, there's usually another one that's the exact opposite of each of these. But this is what was going on in the 1st century. These are how these Christians had been trained to encounter the text before Jesus came. It was normal for them to have these kind of questions. The other one is Pesher. Pesher is a little more narrow in its use. And it's very common to us today. Pesher is unique to the Essene community that has the Dead Sea Scrolls. Our largest batch of ancient biblical text comes from them. But they had a very unique approach. They took some of the principles of Midrash, and they believed that everything was pointing to them. So every time there was a prophecy in the Old Testament, every time there was anything going on, they said it has to do with me. Not just me, but their community together. You ever met someone who ascribes to, say, a premillennial theory of reading the text of Revelation, where every image in there has to do with Israel, Palestine, and Apache AH-64 helicopters? Yeah, the answer is you probably have if you haven't. And that's what they're doing there. They're taking all the prophecies of the Bible and saying it's present tense. Here's the neat thing about the Essenes doing it, though. They lived around the same time that Jesus was to come. And it suggests that it's possible that in the preaching that John did to announce the coming of Christ, some of that was done near their community. So you have people who think everything is about their time frame, who happen to be living when a lot of these things come to pass. And so their reading of the Bible unintentionally, in many cases, came out to be pretty accurate. Even though some things they were really stretching. We actually even encounter a little bit of it in the practice of it in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 2, verse 16, that's where it says, "This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel." So he quotes Joel. He says, "This is coming for now." Or like we looked at last week, Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son." These are examples of New Testament authors by inspiration saying these things, they're about us right now. We still do some of that. If we talk about any time we're reading the Old Testament in a kingdom context and saying we are now in that kingdom that was promised, we're doing that. But here's the caveat. Just like it is with Midrash, there's some boundaries you've got to be thinking. Just like typology and figurative readings and allegories, got to be careful. Just because you think it refers to a now thing doesn't mean it's so. So just because some sequence of numeric combinations in the text of Revelation add up to today's date does not mean that's the case. That kind of numerology is not a Hebrew thing. It's not a Christian thing. And remember, almost every time you read it, you're 3 translations away from the original text, and your math won't math out, especially in English. So to break it down and to think about it in a simplified way, both of these principles, Midrash and Pesher, assume one really valuable tool. The scriptures speak beyond the day they were written. They're talking about more than just history. Midrash is trying to figure out timeless relevance. What does this mean for us today? Pesher speaks about timely revelation. Is there a secret hidden in this text for now? In both of those instances, we're getting opportunity to think about how the Bible is preparing these communities for things. So, like I mentioned already, Acts chapter 2, verses 16 to 21, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. He takes Joel's ancient prophecy of God pouring out his Spirit and then directly applies it to the Pentecost event. This is that declaration resembles Pesher form, but Peter speaks with apostolic authority and inspiration, making his interpretation standardized or normative for Christians. Because you take away Peter's connection to it, and all it is him thinking, this is that. But the minute God's hand is involved, it becomes concretized or made stable in the testimony of God to us. Here's another one. This is from Galatians chapter 3. Eric, do you want to read for us? Just read verse 16 right now of Galatians, the 3rd chapter.
Now the promises were spoken
Paul is doing some pretty careful sifting with this statement, right? He's playing on the grammatical connections of number, person concepts to understand a prophecy. The promise of Abraham, if he refers to your seeds singular, not seeds plural. He then makes the next step. The seed is Christ. If you want to know what style of interpretation that is, that's midrash reading. That's looking closely at the text and trying to suss out or source out these small, fine details. Trent?
Do we kind of do some of this with, like maybe the Psalms where you read maybe a prophecy that is intended to apply to David? Not that it's a bad message or that it's not something that you could look to, but that prophecy doesn't necessarily apply to us, but it would apply to Israel or David or...
Absolutely. And we're not always wrong. You're correct. Sometimes, though, we do stretch things too far. And that's where we have to be very careful to make sure that, hey, a powerful phrase comes in. I read this psalm, and wait for it, and I think this principle is important for us. That's different from, I read this psalm, and I know God meant this for that. Both those things are valuable, but only one of them is equating it to saying, this is what God taught. This is now below that. And so we do that, you're right, we do that with the Psalms, we do that with the prophets, we do that unintentionally with some of the New Testament. Here's the unintentional side. When parts of the Bible get hard to conceptualize, or they get hard to apply, we get uncomfortable. Like, how do I do that? How do I accomplish whatever it is? And so then we back up and we ask these complicated scenario-based questions. Well, what if someone was on a plane and they wanted to be baptized and they couldn't? Ever had that question given to you? Is it a possible thing that could happen? 100% possible. Is it plausible? Not including the hand of God, but is this like an everyday occurrence level of plausibility? I wouldn't put it at that level. I still think it's possible, but it's not even plausible. But we've now engaged midrash, creative thinking things, and we're also then applying some of the principles underneath this. And this is where someone would end up, well, because this is possible, not plausible, but possible, then maybe baptism isn't baptism, maybe it's an allegory. That's how these things function. And it can happen within the community of Christians that you're part of when it gets uncomfortable in other ways. I don't like that God said this, therefore I've got to adjust my perception of things. And you get creative, you create your own level of, well, this and this and this happened. And because these things happened, then it means that this can't be as literal as it seems to be. So now I got to back off. We turn it into an allegory, or we turn it into a figure, and then we get more creative with its application. So learning some of these things actually is also helping us prevent bad interpretation, but also deeply understand exactly what's going on when Paul does that. And Paul wasn't inventing a new form of reading the Bible. He was applying the same form that already existed. And here's the last thing that's really super cool. In every corner of literary human history, people have done the same thing with religious texts and governmental texts and personal messages back and forth. People read everything this way. Ever got a text message from somebody and you look at it and you read it 6 times and you go, I don't know what they mean by this. And it's only got 8 words. Why do we misunderstand a text message like that sometimes? Because we think we can't tell how they feel. And we feel. So even if it's not written in all caps, if it exposes our failure, they're yelling at us. If it exposes our weaknesses, even if they're not related to the text message, why are you yelling at me? Or if it's in all caps, then it's yelling, right? That's the rule. Anything written in all capital letters in a text message is yelling. Except if it's coming from someone with bad vision, and they're like your grandma, and they texted you in all caps, they're not yelling. They're just stuck on caps lock, and they just didn't know. So we assume, or maybe they are yelling. Maybe they're in trouble. We do all these same things. This is very normal. It also helps us then in those Bible studies with others or with our own time together when we read through things. In the 21st century, we've recategorized some of these things. And I've talked about them on the first and second class a little bit already. But we try to think about things in a more holistic way because we've gotten to a point where God has fully revealed Christ to us. So midrash pressure, these figurative allegorical readings are predominantly found before Christ's full message was revealed. And so some of this that was more mysterious is now all clear. So all these things that pointed to the Christ, they were clarified through these outcomes. And here's an example of the Psalms as an approach to it. Thinking about Psalm 22. The context of the 22nd Psalm is David crying out in anguish. A historical reading of the Psalm says this was David's experience. A canonical reading of the Psalm talks about how close it is to the suffering of Christ. Much like we're talking about with Trenton. We like say, hey, are we doing this? Here's a great illustration of it. They pierced my hands and feet. They divided my garments. The Psalm gets read that way partially because the New Testament authors make some links for us, but then we go from their links and we add to it. We see this picture more. And we catch, hey, this is really clearly about the Christ. But when David said it, nobody knew that was anything. It was all about him. And also note this, while it's not the case with this psalm, some of the psalms that are labeled a psalm of David probably are best understood a psalm in the style of David. Especially some of the psalms that are later in the historical text, Davidic style. But they're all labeled the same way, and so it's hard to sort them out on a first reading. But this one here is David speaking, first person. He's accredited as the appropriate author, and he comes forth with that. Another one for us is in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. He prophesies a ruler in Bethlehem who will shepherd Israel. 700 BC. Critical approach would say this is purely a generic hope for a new Davidic king, yet Matthew quotes it as a direct prophecy of Jesus' birthplace. That connects the messianic line edge to it, that this is God's anointed coming, not just any old, hopeful, one day we'll have a king like David again. And so that makes these links take place. The last one we've mentioned a couple different times, and I think it's important to pay attention to, is Genesis 3:15. Les, do you want to read that for us, if you could? This is part of the dialogue between Satan, the devil, and Adam and Eve, and then the outgrowth of that into the curses that are given through God to Eve. Genesis 3, verse 15.
Just one verse.
Just the one verse.
I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
This is seen as the first gospel hint. And so proto-evangelism is the first time the good news gets scooched out there. God tells the serpent that the woman's seed will bruise the serpent's head. Historical reading might simply see that as a myth explaining the differences in the fight between women, human, men, human, and serpents. But Christians have then recognized that this is really talking about the big picture of sin, rebellion, and rescue. And so that's how Genesis 3:15 then gets to be so clearly connected to that relationship, that this is making these sequential steps. We've got about 3 minutes left in our allotted class time, maybe 2. Apologize we didn't have that much room for discussion, but I was trying to take big giant boxes and put them into a smaller package. But do you guys have any observations or questions? We're going to continue applying these things going forward, looking at some of the various Old Testament sections of text. Or observations. Anything that you like or don't like so far? This is where you get to give critical feedback. You can also give that privately too, if you feel like it's a little bit more poignant. We'll go ahead and stop right here then, and then look forward to our continued study next week. Thank you, everybody.